The golden chandelier of the Grand Plaza lobby cast a shimmering light that felt more like a spotlight on a crime scene than a gala. At the center of the vast marble floor, Tahlia Greene was no longer a person, she was a spectacle. Roland Mercer, the hotel's head of security, loomed over her like a thundercloud. His sharp black suit remained perfectly pressed even as he leaned forward, his face contorted in a mask of controlled fury. With a sudden, aggressive movement, he kicked the delivery bag at Tahlia's side. Packages skittered across the floor, their contents, silk scarves and velvet boxes, spilling out like discarded evidence. "Empty the bag, Tahlia," Mercer's voice sliced through the jazz music, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "Or the police will do it while you're in handcuffs." Tahlia's knees hit the cold marble with a sickening thud. Her hands trembled as she tried to gather the scattered items, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. She looked up at the circle of onlookers, the elite of the city, draped in diamonds and indifference. A woman in a ruby gown adjusted her pearls, her eyes glassing over as she turned back to her champagne. A man in a tailored tuxedo sipped his scotch, watching the struggle as if it were a programmed performance. To them, the girl on the floor was merely a stain on the marble. Mercer's hand clamped onto Tahlia's shoulder, forcing her smaller, lower into the stone. "You're a thief," he hissed, his grip tightening until her knuckles turned white against the floor. "And thieves don't get to stand in my lobby." Then, the heavy gold-rimmed doors didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. A man stepped into the light. Alaric Fontaine did not rush. He moved with a rhythmic, terrifying calm that acted as a vacuum, sucking the noise out of the room. He was a pillar of shadow in a room of gold. Behind him, his posture was a straight line of quiet, lethal authority. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the guards. His gaze fixed solely on the kneeling girl. The air in the lobby turned frigid. Mercer's face drained of color, his bravado fracturing into a visible tremor as Alaric reached the center of the floor. The calm man stood like a statue of judgment. Alaric Fontaine didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply reached down to adjust a silver cufflink, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried to every corner of the room. "Take your hands off her, Roland," Alaric said, the words heavy with the weight of a death sentence. "Or I'll buy this hotel just to watch you beg for your job on this very spot." The shift was instantaneous. The girl who had been a thief seconds ago was now under the shadow of a titan. As Alaric's cold eyes remained locked on the sweating security chief, the room understood that the power in the building had just changed hands. The heavy silence that followed Alaric Fontaine's declaration was more suffocating than the accusation itself. Roland Mercer's hand, which had been clamped like a vice on Tahlia's shoulder, didn't just let go, it recoiled as if he had touched live wire. He stumbled back, his face transforming from a mask of arrogant fury into a pale, sweating portrait of dawning horror. The guest in the ruby gown froze with her glass halfway to her lips, the indifference in her eyes replaced by a sharp, jagged edge of fear. Alaric took a single step forward, the click of his polished shoes on the marble sounding like the cocking of a weapon. He didn't look at Mercer, his eyes remained fixed on the girl trembling at his feet. Tahlia's breath hitched, her fingers curling into the fabric of her uniform as she looked up. She didn't see the face of a savior, but a man who held the power of life and death in the tilt of his head. Her chest heaved, the humiliation of the past 10 minutes colliding with a new, terrifying reality. "Mr. Fontaine, there's been a mistake," Mercer stammered, his voice cracking, the authority he had wielded like a club just moments ago now shattered at his feet. She was seen, the vault key was missing, and she was the only one. Alaric didn't wait for him to finish. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a small, heavy object that caught the light of the chandeliers. He dropped it. The gold vault key hit the marble with a clear, melodic chime, sliding across the floor until it tapped against the toe of Mercer's shoe. The security chief stared down at it, his throat working convulsively. The room held its collective breath. The guests shifted, their whispers a low hiss of static as they realized they weren't just witnessing a delivery girl's arrest, they were witnessing a public execution of a man's career, and perhaps his life. Alaric leaned down, offering a hand to Tahlia. His fingers were steady, his skin cold. As Tahlia placed her shaking hand in his, the contact felt like a tether to a storm. He pulled her upward, not with the rough force Mercer had used, but with a deliberate, possessive strength that forced her to stand tall before the very people who had watched her beg. "Roland," Alaric said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire lobby. "The key was in my pocket because I put it there. And the only reason you're still breathing is because I haven't decided where I want you to fall." He turned his back on the security chief, dismissing him as one would a nuisance. He began to lead Tahlia toward the private elevators, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. Behind them, Mercer collapsed against a marble pillar, his knees finally giving out. Tahlia didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the closing gold doors, realizing with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the nightmare of the lobby was over, but the world Alaric Fontaine was bringing her into was far more dangerous. The elevator ascended in a haunting, pressurized silence, the digital floor indicator climbing toward the clouds like a countdown. Tahlia stood in the corner of the mirrored cabin, her reflection a jagged ghost of the girl who had been kneeling on the marble moments before. Her pulse thrummed against her throat, a frantic rhythm that matched the hum of the high-speed lift. Beside her, Alaric Fontaine remained a statue of tailored wool and obsidian intent. He didn't look at her, yet his presence was a suffocating weight, a reminder that she hadn't been freed, she had been claimed. When the doors glided open, they stepped into a world of glass and shadows. The penthouse was a cathedral of minimalist luxury, overlooking a city that looked like a carpet of fallen stars. Alaric walked toward a desk of dark, polished wood, his movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't offer her water. He simply turned, the city light silhouetting his frame into something predatory. "You're wondering why a man like me would step into a lobby to save a girl who delivers packages," Alaric said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a low-frequency vibration. Tahlia's hand sought the hem of her uniform, her fingers twisting the fabric. Her eyes moved to a thick manila folder resting on the desk. Even from across the room, she could see the blurred edges of a photograph peeking out, a grainy shot of her leaving her apartment 3 nights ago. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was a hunt that had reached its conclusion. Alaric tapped the folder with a rhythmic, measured cadence. "Roland Mercer didn't just want you humiliated. He wanted you erased. He sold your debt, Tahlia. Every medical bill your father left behind, every cent you've struggled to pay back, it was bundled, packaged, and put on an auction block for people who deal in human collateral." Tahlia's knees threatened to buckle again, the air in the room suddenly too thin to breathe. She had spent years running from the shadows of her father's past, thinking she was invisible in the gray uniform of a courier. But the shadows had grown long enough to swallow her. "Who bought it?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the vastness of the suite. Alaric stepped closer, the light finally hitting his eyes. They were cold, ancient, and terrifyingly focused. "I did," he said, the words landing with the finality of a slamming vault door. "I bought every contract, every legal claim, and every cent you owe the world. On paper, you don't belong to the debt collectors anymore. You don't even belong to the state." He leaned in, his shadow stretching over her until she felt the heat radiating from him. "From this moment on, you belong to me." The word "belong" hung in the air, heavy and jagged, like a blade resting against Tahlia's skin. She stood frozen, the panoramic view of the city blurring behind Alaric's silhouette. Her mind raced, retreating from the terrifying man in front of her and diving into the wreckage of a memory she had spent a decade trying to bury. It wasn't just the name Mercer that haunted her, it was the way Roland Mercer had looked at her in the lobby, that same predatory glint she had seen through a cracked closet door when she was 8 years old. The penthouse faded, replaced by the smell of rain and expensive tobacco. She remembered a night much like this one, watching from the shadows of her father's office as a younger, leaner Roland Mercer stood exactly where Alaric stood now. He hadn't been a head of security back then, he had been her father's shadow, his most trusted lieutenant. She remembered the hushed voices, the flash of a silver briefcase, and the way Mercer had smiled just before the sirens began to wail in the distance. He hadn't been trying to catch a thief in the lobby tonight, he had been trying to finish the job he started 10 years ago. Tahlia's hands stopped trembling. A different kind of heat began to radiate through her chest, one that tasted of ash and old secrets. She looked at Alaric, her eyes narrowing as she searched his stony expression for a sign of the truth. "You didn't just buy my debt," she whispered, her voice gaining a sharp, dangerous edge. "You knew who was holding it. You knew Roland Mercer was the one who handed my father to the feds." Alaric didn't blink. He moved closer, the scent of cedar and cold steel surrounding her. He reached out, his thumb tracing the faint, red mark Mercer's grip had left on her shoulder. The touch was possessive, but his eyes held a glimmer of something that looked remarkably like respect. "I've been waiting for you to remember," he murmured, his voice a low growl of satisfaction. "Mercer thinks he's spent 10 years climbing the ladder of this hotel, built on the bones of your family's empire. He thinks the girl he forced to kneel tonight was just a ghost he could finally lay to rest." The city lights reflected in Tahlia's pupils, transforming the fear into a cold, calculating fire. She realized then that Alaric Fontaine hadn't brought her here to be a victim or a trophy. He had brought her here to be a weapon. The penthouse felt less like a cage and more like an armory. Mercer had made a mistake, he had reminded Greene how it felt to be wronged, and he had done it in front of the only man powerful enough to help her strike back. "He didn't recognize me," Tahlia said, her voice steadying into a calm that mirrored Alaric's own. "He will," Alaric promised, his hand dropping from her shoulder to the manila folder on the desk. He flipped it open, revealing a floor plan of the hotel's private vault, the one Mercer claimed she had robbed. "By the time we're finished, he'll wish he had let you walk out of that lobby, and he'll realize that the girl he forced to kneel is the one who will eventually sign his death warrant." The hum of the penthouse's climate control was the only sound in the room, yet to Tahlia, it felt like a roar. Her eyes remained locked on the manila folder, but she wasn't seeing the floor plans anymore. She was looking at a series of internal HR memos from the various courier firms she had worked for over the last 3 years. Every time a branch was about to close, or a manager threatened to lay her off, a private endowment, or an anonymous corporate subsidy, had appeared out of thin air, specifically earmarked for her position. She turned the pages with trembling fingers, her breath hitching as she saw the familiar Fontaine crest stamped on the wire transfer receipts. This wasn't just protection, it was curation. For 3 years, she had believed she was surviving on grit and luck, navigating the city's shadows alone. In reality, she had been moving through a corridor built by the man standing before her. "You didn't just find me tonight," Tahlia whispered, the realization tasting like copper in her mouth. She looked up at Alaric, who was now pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He didn't offer her any. He simply watched her over the rim of the glass, his expression unreadable. "You've been there the whole time. Every time my rent was late and a clerical error cleared it, every time I nearly lost my job." Alaric set the glass down with a sharp, echoing clack on the wooden desk. "The world is a hungry place, Tahlia. Especially for a Greene. If I hadn't kept the wolves at bay, you wouldn't have made it to this hotel tonight." He moved closer, his presence expanding to fill the space between them. "I wasn't just keeping you employed. I was keeping you hidden. Because as long as you were just a girl on a bicycle, Mercer wouldn't look too closely at your face. He wouldn't see the ghost of the man he betrayed." Tahlia felt a cold shiver race down her spine. The invisible life she had cultivated wasn't her own design, it was Alaric's. He had been the architect of her survival, a silent guardian who had watched her struggle from the safety of his glass tower. The gratitude she expected to feel was drowned out by a surge of terrifying vulnerability. She had been his project, his long-term investment. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steadying despite the chaos in her chest. If you wanted me hidden, why let Mercer corner me in the lobby? Why let him force me to my knees? Alaric's eyes darkened, the calm exterior finally flickering with a spark of something lethal. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face before he pulled back, as if restraining a violent impulse. Because the debt has matured, he murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. And because it's time Mercer realized that the girl he tried to crush is the one who's going to take everything he's built, and I want to be the one holding the leash when you do. The air in the hotel's service corridors was thick with the scent of floor wax and stale adrenaline. Tahlia pressed her back against the cold steel of the ventilation shaft, her breath a ghost of a sound as she peered through the slats of the high-mounted grate. Below her, the Grand Plaza's boardroom was a fortress of dark mahogany and low, flickering light. At the head of the table sat Roland Mercer, his face flushed with a frantic, desperate energy. He wasn't the untouchable titan from the lobby anymore, he was a cornered animal trying to gnaw his way out of a trap. Around the table, 4 board members sat like stone statues, their faces illuminated only by the blue glow of a digital spreadsheet projected onto the far wall. The numbers were bleeding red. Tahlia's hands gripped the metal edges of the vent as she watched Mercer slide a thick stack of documents across the table. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, sharpening clarity. The discrepancy began 3 months ago, Mercer lied, his voice strained and thin. We tracked the digital signatures back to the courier intake system. It wasn't a banking error. It was a physical breach. He tapped a photo on the table, the grainy image of Tahlia kneeling in the lobby, surrounded by the spilled packages. Tahlia Greene was the carrier for every single shipment that went missing. She's been skimming the high-value deposits for years, using her father's old connections to move the assets. The theft isn't just local, it's $1 million hemorrhage. Tahlia felt the sting of the metal cutting into her palms. She watched as Mercer displayed a forged signature on the screen, a perfect, haunting replica of her own handwriting on a deposit slip for a sum she couldn't even fathom. The board members leaned in, their expressions shifting from skepticism to a predatory focus. Mercer was offering them a sacrificial lamb to cover the hole he had dug in their accounts. He was handing them her life on a silver platter to save his own skin. She's currently in custody, Mercer continued, his smile turning jagged and cruel as he regained his footing. By morning, the police will have a confession, and the insurance will cover the loss. The Greene name will finally be buried where it belongs. Through the grate, Tahlia saw the board members nod in slow, rhythmic unison. The trap was closing. But then, a shadow flickered at the edge of the boardroom doors. Tahlia's eyes darted to the entrance as the heavy oak panels began to move, not from a knock, but from a force that didn't ask for permission. The temperature in the vent seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mercer's smile faltered, his gaze snapping toward the door as the silhouette of Alaric Fontaine blocked out the hallway light. The board members went rigid. Tahlia realized then that Alaric hadn't sent her into the vents to hide, he had sent her there to witness the exact moment the wolves began to eat each other. The oak doors didn't just open, they groaned under the weight of a presence that demanded the room's oxygen. Alaric Fontaine stepped into the boardroom, his silhouette slicing through the blue light of the projector like a blade. Roland Mercer bolted upright, his chair screeching against the floor, while 2 of his personal security goons, massive men with thick necks and hidden holsters, moved instinctively to block Alaric's path. They were professionals, trained to handle threats, but as Alaric continued his rhythmic, predatory advance, their hands began to ghost over their waistbands with uncharacteristic hesitation. Alaric stopped 3 feet from the table, his eyes fixed solely on Mercer. He didn't look at the guards. He didn't acknowledge the board members who had just signed Tahlia's life away. The silence was so absolute that the hum of the ventilation shaft where Tahlia lay hidden sounded like a thunderstorm. Alaric slowly reached for the middle button of his charcoal suit jacket. It was a movement so deliberate, so laden with lethal intent, that the 2 guards took a collective step back. The button slid free. Then the next. As the fabric of his jacket draped open, the silver glint of a shoulder holster caught the projector's light, reflecting a cold, metallic flash onto the forged documents on the table. He didn't reach for the weapon. He didn't have to. The mere revelation of the steel was a statement of sovereignty, a reminder that in this room of white-collar thieves, the apex predator had arrived. Mercer's throat worked convulsively, a bead of sweat tracing a jagged line down his temple. The guards' hands dropped to their sides, their fingers trembling. They knew the math of the underworld: some men you fight, and some men you simply hope don't notice you. You were discussing $1 million loss, Roland, Alaric murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal water glasses on the table. And you were using a very specific name to cover the scent of your own rot. Mr. Fontaine, this is a private board matter, one of the members stammered, his voice lacking any real conviction. Alaric's gaze shifted to the board member, and the man went instantly silent, his face draining of color. Alaric turned back to Mercer, leaning over the table until he was inches from the security chief's face. The smell of expensive tobacco and cold rain drifted toward the vent where Tahlia watched, her heart hammering against the metal. "The green name doesn't belong in your mouth," Alaric whispered, the words sounding like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "And the money you've been siphoning into your offshore accounts doesn't belong to the hotel. It belongs to me." He straightened his posture, his jacket still flared open, exposing the machinery of his violence. "You have 60 seconds to tell these gentlemen the truth about the signatures, or I'll let my associates explain it to you in the basement." Mercer looked at his guards, but they wouldn't meet his eyes. He looked at the board, but they were already leaning away from him, smelling the scent of a dead man. The trap hadn't just closed, it had been replaced by an executioner's block. The digital projector flickered, casting a strobe-like jitter over Roland Mercer's crumbling composure. From the shadows of the doorway, Alaric Fontaine reached into the same manila folder that had once held Tahlia's death warrant and produced a single, decrypted hard drive. He didn't look at the board, he looked directly at the ventilation grate high on the wall, as if he could see the fire burning in Tahlia's eyes through the steel slats. With a silent nod, he signaled for her to emerge. The sound of the vent cover hitting the carpet was a thunderclap in the silent room. Tahlia descended from the service crawlspace, her uniform smudged with dust, her knuckles scraped raw, but her posture straighter than it had been in a decade. Mercer's eyes bulged, his breath hitching in a pathetic, wet rattle as the delivery girl he had forced to kneel stepped into the blue light of the boardroom. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a reckoning. Alaric held out the drive, his fingers grazing hers as he handed her the weapon. "The choice is yours, Tahlia," he murmured, his voice a dark caress that ignored the trembling men surrounding them. "This drive contains every offshore routing number, every forged signature, and the original footage of Mercer sabotaging the vault. You can take this to the authorities and reclaim your name, or you can hand it back to me, and I will ensure he is erased from more than just the hotel's payroll." The room held its breath. Mercer scrambled toward her, his hands outstretched in a desperate, clawing plea. "Tahlia, please, your father and I, we were partners. I can make this right. I'll give you everything." Tahlia looked down at the man who had built a throne out of her family's ruins. She felt the weight of the drive in her palm, the power to destroy and the power to heal. Her thumb traced the cold plastic edge. For years, she had survived by being invisible, by swallowing the bile of injustice and disappearing into the city's gray corners. She looked at Alaric, seeing the lethal promise in his gaze, and then back at the board members who had been ready to sacrifice her for their bottom line. She didn't hand the drive to Alaric. Instead, she walked to the head of the mahogany table and slammed the drive into the board's laptop. "My father's partner didn't let him go to prison alone," Tahlia said, her voice echoing with a crystalline, terrifying authority. "And I'm not going to let you hide in the shadows of a mafia war, Roland." She hit the enter key, the screen erupting into a cascade of evidence that began uploading directly to the Federal Fraud Bureau in real time. "I'm not hiding anymore. You're going to watch the world tear down everything you stole, stone by stone." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Alaric stepped up behind her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. Mercer collapsed into his chair, a broken shell of a man, as Tahlia watched her own liberation flash across the screen. The girl who knelt was gone, and the woman standing in her place was just getting started. 3 weeks later, the gold-leaf doors of the Grand Plaza swung open with a familiar, heavy groan, but the atmosphere inside shifted as if the building itself held its breath. The jazz music didn't falter, yet the chatter of the city's elite died in a wave of sudden, jagged recognition. Tahlia Greene stepped onto the marble floor, her footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, steady confidence that silenced the room. She was no longer draped in a faded courier's uniform, she wore a gown of midnight silk that shimmered like oil on water, her hair swept back to reveal a face that no longer sought the shadows. Beside her, Alaric Fontaine walked with the same lethal, measured calm, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that was less about support and more about a declaration of territory. They reached the exact center of the lobby, the very spot where the marble had once felt cold against Tahlia's knees. The wealthy guests who had turned their backs on her screams now stood like statues, their crystal flutes frozen midair. The woman in the ruby gown, the same one who had watched Tahlia's humiliation with bored indifference, now lowered her head in a frantic, hurried show of respect. Tahlia stopped, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. She didn't see people, she saw the witnesses to her father's downfall and her own rebirth. She looked toward the security desk, where a new team stood in rigid formation, their eyes fixed forward, terrified of even glancing at the woman who now held their contracts in her hand. Roland Mercer was gone, a ghost erased by the very evidence Tahlia had unleashed, but his legacy of fear had been replaced by something far more permanent. Alaric leaned in, his voice a low, private vibration against her ear that sent a shiver of fire down her spine. "They're waiting for a sign, Tahlia. Tell them who owns the air they breathe." Tahlia didn't smile. She reached out and took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her fingers steady, her eyes locked on the boardroom doors where her future had been decided. She realized then that Alaric hadn't just given her back her name, he had given her the throne built from the wreckage of her enemies. She raised the glass slightly, a silent toast to the girl who had knelt on this floor, before turning toward the private elevators that led to the owner's suite. As the gold doors glided shut, sealing them away from the bowing crowd, Tahlia looked at Alaric. The debt was paid, the justice was served, but as he reached out to unbutton his jacket, his eyes burning with a dark, possessive pride, she knew the real story was only beginning. The delivery girl was dead, and the queen of the Grand Plaza had finally come home. The camera lingers on the closing gold doors of the elevator, the light reflecting off the midnight silk of Tahlia's gown. The delivery girl who knelt on that marble is dead. But in this city, a name like Greene doesn't just return without waking the ghosts of the past. Tahlia has the hotel, she has the evidence, and she has the shadow of Alaric Fontaine, but she's about to find out that some debts can't be paid with money. The screen cuts to black. A date appears in sharp, metallic text. Is Alaric truly her guardian, or is she just the latest piece in a much larger game? And what happens when Mercer's allies decide that the owner's suite is a target they can't ignore? Drop your location and the time you're watching in the comments below. Was Alaric right to step in, or has Tahlia just entered a cage far more dangerous than the one she left? Don't miss the next chapter of power, betrayal, and blood. Subscribe and hit the notification bell now, because part 2 drops this Saturday.